Father, thank you so much for this day. Thank you that we can gather together to worship you, our great God. God, we are united here around who you are, around your word, around your love, around the truth of the gospel. That's why we gather today. So, Lord, help us to be quiet in our minds and our hearts. Help us to hear from you, from your word. Lord, lead us by your Spirit to be the people that you would desire for us to be. We love you, Jesus, and we pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen. I love how Jeff said, we dug him out of that, like he implied like he was digging himself. He sat in the passenger, or in the driver's seat, while Greg and I beast moded him out of the side of a mountain. It was pretty epic. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open up to the book of Mark. We're going to be picking up where we left off last week in Mark chapter 10. I loved listening to the sermon that Chad kind of presented last week about the rich young ruler and how I love the way that he articulated that the problem that Jesus was really getting at, that he was exposing in this rich young ruler, was that the motivation of his heart was that he loved the things of God more than the king himself. And just that challenge that you and I really need to always be evaluating. Do we love God's things more than the king? And so we're going to pick up in Mark chapter 10, but I wanted to share with you a story. Several months back, my wife and I have kind of hung our hats a little bit, myself, I'll just speak for me, a lot of pride for several years around the fact that our oldest son is 15, he'll be 16 this week, and up until a few months ago, we had never had a broken bone or an emergency hospital visit. Like, that was a point of pride in our home. And then a handful of months ago, I wish this isn't how the story unfolded, but I was on duty. And I took my kids to the park. And my youngest daughter, Sadie, was crawling on this like monkey bar type thing. And she reached out for a monkey bar that looked like it was within her reach, and it really wasn't. And she plummeted to the ground, and she went to brace herself because she's got cat-like reflexes with her wrist, and landed all of her weight on her wrist. She started to cry and moan and snot bubble, and she came running over and crawled up in my arms. And you need to know this about my family. We are not at all anti-doctor. We are slow to doctor. We don't rush to the doctor because we're cheap. And so we just trust that kids are going to shake it off and we'll be okay, and just rub some dirt on it and you'll be fine. And so she's sitting there crying, and I'm asking her to move her wrist, and she can't really do it very well, but I'm like, she'll be fine. We've never had a broken bone. We're crushing it as parents. She'll walk it off. And a few hours go by, and she's still crying. And she's still just really struggling. We've iced it, and I found a brace or like an ACE wrap or something, and I've got it immobilized. And now at this point, it's getting later in the night, and unfortunately, again, I wish this story was better, but like now at this point, we're looking at urgent care after hours pricing, which I don't even know what that's going to equate to, but I don't want to pay for it because I'm cheap. And so we're really wrestling back and forth with what's the right thing to do. And eventually we got to the point where we said, you know what? It's too late. We'll do something about this tomorrow. Just go to sleep. We're like, I promise we love our kids. Like, we really do. And the next morning we took her to the doctor, and sure enough, she had broken her arm. And I know, right? Like, what a terrible dad that like I made her sleep all night with a broken arm. And so here's why I share that with you. We had to get to a point where we acknowledged the bad news, that my daughter had in fact really hurt herself. The fact that hours had gone by, she hadn't shaken it off. She wasn't being able to get comfortable. She wasn't being able to be consoled. We had to acknowledge the bad news. And once we did that, we went to the doctor and they said, man, you should have brought her last night. What is wrong with you guys? And they put it, but here's the good news, which is what good news always does. Good news invades bad spaces. The good news was it was a hairline fracture that God has designed our bodies beautifully. It was going to heal itself. It wasn't like it was dangling there like the Joe Theismann video or anything. Like it was a small fracture. and we just needed to splint it for a few weeks, and now she's totally fine, and she knows she's loved and cared for by her mom and dad, and she's young enough, she's not gonna remember it anyway. So, but here's what, we had to acknowledge the bad news so that the good news that God has given us doctors who are awesome, who can look inside the body and say, hey, yes, it's bad, but it's gonna get better. We've got a plan and a path for her care and for healing. In order for us, for the good news to be acknowledged, we had to acknowledge the bad news. And this morning, as we walk through our story, what I want us to see is that good news always invades bad spaces. And my hope and my prayer for us and my challenge for us this morning is that we would see the good news of the gospel and then open our hearts to allow it to invade those bad spaces where maybe there's pride, maybe there's unforgiveness, maybe there's bitterness, jealousy, rage, anger, lust, lies, fear, that we would open our hearts to allow the good news to touch all of those bad spaces so that you and I could walk in the light of new life. That's where our story is going to take us, and that's going to be my challenge for us, is that we would see the good news invading bad spaces. And so with that, let's jump in to verse 32 of Mark chapter 10, as today we're kind of wrapping up this middle section that we've been in the story of Jesus in the book of Mark. And if I can get that thing out of the way, let's just jump in. Verse 32, they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. Let's pause because that's too good to skip over here. They're heading to Jerusalem. We've been in this middle section where over and over and over again, we're seeing Jesus prepare his disciples for the fact that he is going to the cross, that he is in fact the Christ, and the Christ is going to suffer. He's going to be rejected, he's going to be convicted, and he's going to be killed, and then he's going to rise again. I love that every time we see Jesus talking about his death, we also hear him declaring victory. But the whole purpose of this middle section of Mark is that the disciples would see and understand that Jesus has a painful road ahead of him, but that there's great victory and hope that is coming. And so he's preparing them, he's training them. And so we have made kind of this final turn. Jesus has set his face towards Jerusalem, where his death is awaiting him there. And as they're heading towards Jerusalem, let's notice, where is Jesus amongst the crowd? He's out in front. He's leading the pack to his own murder. He's sprinting towards his death. He's not running from the pain, he's moving towards it. Because it's only through the pain and the hardship that awaits him in Jerusalem that you and I have hope, that you and I have freedom, that we have victory. And so Jesus doesn't run from the pain, he moves towards it. And in fact, he leads out in front of everybody. And it says, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. A question that has loomed large all throughout our study of the book of Mark is, who is this Jesus, and how are we going to respond? And we see two different responses here. There's a group of people that as they're following Jesus and as they see his passion and his persistence to get to Jerusalem, to suffer and die, one group is amazed. They're overwhelmed and in awe that Jesus is purposefully headed towards a hard and painful road. And another group is afraid. That what Jesus is doing, where he's heading, the things that he's saying is creating this fear of, well, what does that mean for us? How are we going to respond to him? What are we going to do with this? And so again, I want to continue to lay before us the question that all of us have to wrestle with and find an answer to is, how are you going to respond to the King? One way is to respond in awe, in wonder at what he has done for you. Or are you going to be afraid and say, no, this is too uncomfortable. This isn't how I want it to be. That means I have to surrender control, and I just don't know what to do with it. But the question that Mark consistently wants to ask is, how are you going to respond? And we get two pictures here of response in people being amazed and people being afraid. And Jesus is going to do what he's been doing all throughout this middle section. He's going to pull the disciples aside. It says, taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was happening to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles." That's important. We'll come back to that in just a second. "They will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise." I think it's important for us to know that Jerusalem is a city kind of set up on a hill, on a plateau. And so you literally had to ascend. You had to walk up a road to get to Jerusalem. And inside of Jerusalem is the temple where the people of God would come to worship God, to offer up their praise, to offer up their sacrifices and atone for sin. You literally had to ascend to get into the presence of God with his people. And so they're going up to Jerusalem. And as they're escalating up the side of this mountain, Jesus is going to instruct and remind him for now the third time in 3 chapters. He wants his disciples to see clearly, I'm going to suffer and die. And he paints a brutally honest picture here of what awaits him in Jerusalem. And just like they're ascending into the city of Jerusalem, they're climbing up, we see kind of an escalating journey of pain for Jesus as we walk through what he says waits for him in Jerusalem. He's going to be delivered over, handed over to the religious leaders of the day, the chief priests and the scribes. That he's going to be betrayed and handed over to the religious leaders, and they're going to sentence him, condemn him to death. But unfortunately, the religious leaders don't have the legal authority to put Jesus to death. They're not the ones in power. That's Rome. That's the Roman rulers. And so they are going to not only deliver him into the hands of the chief priests, but they're going to turn him over to Rome, to the Gentiles, so that he can be legally executed. So that this isn't a scandalous death. This isn't something done in the cover of night or a back alley murder. This is a legally sanctioned execution that awaits Jesus. They're going to turn him over to the Gentiles so he can be murdered. And he says that he's going to be mocked. He's going to be ridiculed and made fun of. He's going to be spit upon. What a complete sign of disrespect. It says he's going to be flogged. This was something Rome had essentially perfected. It was this really long whip that at the end of it had bone and glass, and they would strip the criminals down to virtually no clothing. They would stretch them out, and these Roman soldiers would take the whip with bone and glass and shards of metal, and they would hit the criminals in their backs and in their sides. And as you were hit with these different pieces of metal and bone and glass, it would sink into the flesh and it would hook in, and then they would jerk it out, tearing the flesh from the back of Jesus. And they had so perfected this that they had it attuned to know that if you hit a criminal 40 times, he was going to die. So in grace, they would only beat them 39 times. To prolong suffering. It was not gracious at all. They wanted to prolong suffering and torment. They had perfected this, and Jesus is leading the pack to get to this punishment. And then ultimately it's going to result in his death. So he's going to be killed. And then as he has done every single time he has predicted his death, he not only declares his death, but he declares victory. He says, and after 3 days, he will rise. The grave will not hold him. He will emerge victorious. This is good news. This is what is required for our sin debt. For every area in your heart where there's bad news, where there's places that you have defied and rejected the will of God, a penalty is owed. And Jesus is moving towards Jerusalem to pay that penalty. This is good news. But in order for news to be good, it has to invade bad spaces. And what we're going to see is that the gospel doesn't just become something that you believe in VBS or in Sunday school or as a kid or at Campus Crusade. It's not the beginning, it's the beginning, the middle, and the end. One of our values as a church is gospel centrality. We want everything in our lives to kind of orient around the good news of who Jesus is and what he came to do, how he rescued us out of darkness and into light. And so we need the good news of the gospel to touch all those bad spaces in our lives. And Jesus is going to do that with his disciples as the story continues. Verse 35 says, James and John, these are two of the 12 disciples, two friends of Jesus. John is probably his best friend, said the sons of Zebedee came up to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. It's a little bold, isn't it? Like, is that how you started out your prayer time this morning? Or are you guys journaling that when you're having your Devo time? Like, God, do what I tell you to do. Maybe don't pray that way this week. I am a little challenged by their confidence to approach the king in this manner, but I think there could be an element of humility kind of added in to this. But they come up to Jesus and they say, we want you to do whatever we want. And Jesus doesn't get angry. He doesn't scream at them. He doesn't roll his eyes. He doesn't ignore their question. Look at the patience and kindness of our king. In verse 36, he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? Pay attention to that question. That's not the last time he's going to ask that this morning. He says, what do you want from me? And they said to him, verse 37, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. They still wrongly assume that Jesus is going to Jerusalem to assume an earthly kingdom, to overthrow Rome, to make the religious leaders look foolish, to take his place on his throne here in this kingdom. And so they're essentially saying, Jesus, when we get to Jerusalem and you take your position of power, we want to sit at your right and your left. We want to be powerful. We want position. We want honor, fame, money, wealth, all of that. Jesus, we want to be looked up to and revered almost as equally as you do. Maybe it's helpful for us to think of it this way. If they're saying, Jesus, when you become president, we want to be your vice president and your chief of staff, the next two most powerful people. That's who we want to be. They're asking for power. This is their pride. This is a bad space that the good news of what Jesus has come to do needs to invade. And so Jesus is going to ask them a question. But before he does, he's going to expose how they're still in process. Verse 38 says, Jesus said, you do not know what you are asking. So you guys, you think you want to follow me. You think you want to go through what I'm going to go through. You don't realize how painful that is. You're still in process. He says, are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? As they would have heard Jesus ask this question, they would have understood that in the Old Testament, whenever you hear God's wrath or his judgment being poured out, it's always being poured out of a cup. That his cup of wrath, his cup of judgment is poured out on those who rebel, on the sinful and the wicked generations. It is often an imagery associated with wickedness and judgment. And so when Jesus here is saying, can you drink the cup? He's saying, can you endure God's wrath? Because that's the cup that's waiting for me in Jerusalem. And then the idea of baptism, I don't think he's talking about earlier in Mark when he was baptized by John the Baptist. I think it's this idea of being fully immersed, completely overwhelmed and consumed. He's saying what awaits me is an immersion, an overwhelming sensation of God's wrath. He's saying, can you endure that? Can you drink that cup? Can you be submersed in the wrath and judgment of God? Because that's where I'm going. If you're coming with me, that's what waits for us. And then we see again the self-reliance and the pride in James and John. They said to him, we are able. These are men who don't know that they're still in process. They think they've arrived. They've got it all together. They think, yep, Jesus, we'll go, we'll follow you. We can do this. And Jesus is going to essentially tell them, you're not completely wrong, but you're focusing on the wrong things. They said, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. Here's what I think Jesus is saying here. I think Jesus is saying, you guys are going to suffer like I'm going to suffer. You are going to have to endure as I'm going to have to endure. There is hardship waiting for you. You think you're able. You're not there yet, but you're going to get there. Because church history would tell us James is ultimately going to be beheaded as a martyr for his faith and following of Jesus. John is going to live a very long life and for a good portion of that be exiled on an island alone. And he's going to have to watch his friends and his followers die martyr's death. And he's going to live an isolated life where he is going to suffer and it is going to be hard. And so in a very real sense, they are going to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. But he's saying here, when the good news is coming into those bad spaces, you're not worried about your power. You're not worried about your position. You're not consumed with these things. That's already been taken care of. Don't worry about that. You're thinking wrongly. Saying, fix your eyes on me. And we see that Jesus here is trying to orient their minds around the good news of who he is and what he's heading to Jerusalem to do. And so we've seen pride, and we've seen self-reliance. Now we also see here that the fact that they even asked this question creates disunity amongst the disciples. In verse 41, it says, when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. They get furious that they asked this question. And if I could just speculate for a second, I don't think the disciples are angry because they had the gall to ask this question. How dare you ask for power and position? I don't think they're offended at the question. I think they're offended at the idea that they should get it and not the other 10. What gives you the right to sit at his right and his left? That's where we want to be. I don't think this is them being more holy. I think it's them being just as selfish, saying we want that too. And it's creating a disharmony and a disunity amongst the 12. And so Jesus is going to use this as a teachable moment to enter in and really call them, because of the good news, to live differently. He says, Jesus called them to him. He rallied them up. He says, huddle up, guys. We got to have a conversation here. He said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. I will forever be grateful. Jeff, or the video mentioned Mrs. Good News. I will forever be grateful for Mrs. Good News and how in Redemption Kids, we teach our kids about the danger of the I want my own way heart. That's what Jesus is saying here. He's saying, you know how the rest of the world lives. Everybody lives with their I want my own way heart. They go into relationships, they go into work, they go into culture, and they say, what's in it for me? How can you better my life and my situation? Bring me more happiness, bring me more joy. And he's saying, it's not that way with you. That's not how you're supposed to live. We are supposed to live differently. Not going into every relationship and every circumstance with an I want my own way heart. That's not what the good news of the gospel came to do. It came to set us free from living that way. And Jesus is going to further instruct them. He says, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be a slave of all. If we can just maybe leave that up here for a second. Can we just be honest with each other for a little bit? In our flesh, we hate this verse, don't we? It sounds real good on a Sunday morning. It'd probably look real good on a coffee cup or like a cross stitch or a pillow or something. But in practical life, don't you kind of hate that this is in the Bible? If you could, wouldn't you want this to be gone? Because here's how it manifests, at least in my life. Maybe this is just me and this becomes confession and therapy time, and I'm cool with that. This verse is saying, at the end of the day, when I'm exhausted from a hard day, and my wife comes to me and says, sweetie, my back hurts. Will you rub my back? And just a back rub. I'm gonna let that sink in for a moment, okay? You guys, we all got there. I'm supposed to serve her and do that. Or when my kids, after the 19th time of being put to bed, and we've prayed and we've gotten all the water bottles and we've sang the songs and told the stories and read the books, and they keep like a yo-yo popping out and coming back out, rather than getting frustrated because I'm not getting my way, I'm supposed to die to myself and serve them in that moment. I don't like that. That's not what I want to do in that moment. I want my own way, in my flesh. This rubs against who we are. Yet Jesus says, in my kingdom, if you want to be great, you need to serve others. You need to be willing to enter in and love and care for the least of these. I stumbled upon a counseling podcast a couple of weeks ago, and I've been listening to it, and it's even fascinating to me when you dig into some of like the neuroscience of how God has hardwired our brains. That if you go into every situation saying, I'm going to look for ways for people to make me happier, to better my situation, to better my life. And so you go into work looking at how can you use people to bring you joy? How can you use people to better your situation? If you go into church and you're like, how can this church make me feel better about who I am? And you go into your friend groups and your marriage and your family, and if every situation is about how can you wring out and get the most from those around you, those people who attack life that way are some of the most miserable and depressed people on the planet. That when all you are is looking for how to use people to better your circumstance, it doesn't do what you're setting out to do. Yet something chemically happens in our brain when you enter into a situation and say, how can I love? How can I serve? How can I lift other people up? How can I be a servant of those around me? God literally has wired our brains to the people who attack life that way are more joyful, are more content, are more fulfilled, and are genuinely happier people because it's not all about them. If you're going into every circumstance looking at how can I be served, you're going to continually be frustrated. But if you go in saying, how can I serve? How can I love? You will be more fulfilled, you will be more faithful to what God has called us to. And the good news is going to enter in and start to expose all of those bad places where Jesus is still working on us, that we're all still in process. And what I love about how Jesus kind of wraps up this teaching time is he's not just going to tell this, he's not just going to preach this at them, but rather he's going to say, you guys, this is what I came to do. And we hit here kind of the theme anthem verse. If you summarized the book of Mark in one verse, it really would be verse 45, saying that even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus came as the suffering servant who laid his life down, he says, as a ransom. Now, when you and I hear that word, you probably either think of a Mel Gibson movie or kidnapping. But that's not how they would have heard this. They would have heard the term ransom as a legal term, that if I am in bondage, if I am a slave because I had this massive debt that I couldn't take care of on my own, and I am stuck in darkness and bondage and slavery, that it was possible at this time for someone to come and enter into a legal contract where they could buy me out. They could write a check and buy me out of my bondage and my slavery. And it was paying a ransom to get me out of a bad situation. Jesus is saying, I'm coming to pay a debt, to get you out of darkness and bondage. That's why I came, to lay my life down. And by laying my life down, the good news of the gospel, I'm getting you out of a bad place. That's why he came. He says, I'm not just telling you what to do, I'm showing you what to do. And then he's going to pivot from here to a real life, practical example of how he came not to be served, but to serve. And so verse 46 says, they came to Jericho. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. Now, let's just understand what's happening here. Jericho is an oasis, a desert oasis town on the way to Jerusalem. It's about 20 miles north of Jerusalem, and it was an incredibly popular place. While the Jews were on their way to temple or on their way to Jerusalem, they would usually most likely pause and get rested and refreshed and resupplied in Jericho for that last kind of home stretch journey up to Jerusalem. And so it was a really densely populated area. And so Jesus here most likely is spending the night to get refreshed, to get ready for the home stretch journey to Jerusalem. And so he spent a little bit of time in Jericho. And as he's heading out of town on a busy road with a great crowd following with him, we get this new character introduced named Bartimaeus. He's a blind beggar. He's sitting on the side of the road. He is completely dependent on other people's generosity and care to get by. And I couldn't help but think this week, like, when was the last time Bartimaeus probably felt encouraged or hopeful or didn't feel fear or shame or discouragement? And I don't know about you guys. I travel 287 kind of a lot, up and down 287. And if you're familiar with 287 and where 34 kind of intersect, whether you're going north or south, right there on those corners, often you will see people with signs asking for help. And I just have to confess, like, the danger when you travel a road frequently like that is, and I'll just confess, I'm up and down that road so often it becomes really easy to not see those image bearers of God anymore. I just get so consumed with what's going on in my world, what's going on in my life, and where am I going and what am I doing, that I can miss out on the people that are in need right there on that corner. I can't help but wonder how many people just blew right by Bartimaeus that day. How many people had traveled up and down so often that they didn't see somebody who was hurting and in need, somebody who was suffering and needed compassion and care. And he's going to hear that this guy that's leaving town is Jesus. And I love how he responds. It says, when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. He calls out to Jesus not only by name, but also by legacy. That you're the Son of David. This is a term of honor and respect. He is exalting Jesus in this moment, and he's calling on the character of Christ to say, would you have mercy on me? All these other people are blowing by me. Nobody else sees me. Jesus, would you see me and have mercy on me? Would you care about my circumstance? We see the crowd that's around him says many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. They said, Jesus has places to go and things to do. He doesn't have time for you. Would you hush? And I love the passionate and persistent plea of Bartimaeus. He cried out all the more at the end of verse 48, Son of David, have mercy on me. He's not going to stop crying out to Jesus. He doesn't care what the people around him are saying. He's desperate to be in front of the King. I wonder, what are you passionately and persistently praying for? You're like, Jesus, I will not give up asking you for this. I'm going to keep interceding. I'm going to continue to come before you. I'm not going to get discouraged. I'm not going to give up. I love that he will not surrender. He will not give up. He's going to continue to cry out to Jesus. And the response from Jesus has just absolutely marveled my soul all week. It says, verse 49, and Jesus stopped. He's heading towards the cross. He's moving towards Jerusalem. His mission is moving forward. And as he's headed towards a painful and hard place, he doesn't miss this moment. And the passionate and persistent cry of Bartimaeus causes Jesus for just a moment to hit pause on heading towards the cross and enter in with this man. And he said, call him, bring him here, summon him. I want to have a conversation with him. And so they go, the disciples go, and they call the blind man, saying to him, take heart. Literally, that's be courageous. I wonder who in here this morning needs to be told, be courageous. The good news of the gospel didn't invade your life, didn't come and rescue you out of darkness so that you could sit on the sideline, but God came to give you heart. Be courageous. He says, get up. He is calling you. The King has summoned you into his presence. Would you come? Jesus is calling you. I love that the story starts with Bartimaeus calling out to Jesus. That he's calling. He wants Jesus to hear him. He wants an audience with the King. But the real power comes when Jesus calls him. When Jesus says, would you come and be with me? Be courageous. Get up. The King is calling. And look at how Bartimaeus responds. Verse 50. Throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. He can't wait to be in the presence of Jesus. He jumps up, he throws off his coat, and he just starts running. I'm going to go be with Jesus. And Jesus said to him, listen to this question. What do you want me to do for you? It's the exact same question he asked James and John. And when he asked James and John, what did they ask for? Power, position, fame, prominence amongst their peers. Look at how Bartimaeus is going to respond. The blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. The way that that's phrased, I've got to believe that at some point, Bartimaeus knew the beauty and the gift that was the ability to see. And he's lost it along the way. And so he's literally asking Jesus, would you bring me out of darkness? Would you restore me? Would you rescue me? Two very different responses to the same question, is it not? One asks for power and prominence. The other wants the power of God to wash over him and bring him out of darkness. This question is a beautiful question by the King that exposes our heart's motivation. Exposes, do we really want Jesus, or are we in this for ourselves? And Bartimaeus just wants the power of God present in his life, and that's going to lead Jesus to say, go your way, your faith has made you well. Because you believe that I have the power to bring you out of darkness, I'm going to do so. I'm going to bring you out of darkness. And it says, immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. Look at what he does with this gift. Man, I've been brought out of darkness. I've been given the light and new life. And with that, I'm following Jesus. The good news enters into bad spaces so that you and I can live in the light of a new life, to follow Jesus. And it's interesting, this is, in the book of Mark, the very last healing miracle that we will see. And I don't think it's insignificant that the last healing miracle we see is Jesus taking and restoring sight, giving the gift of sight to somebody who could not see. The entire middle section that we've been soaking in for the past several weeks has been all about Jesus trying to equip his disciples to see who he is and where he's going. He wants them to see clearly, I'm going to suffer and die to set you free. That the good news of the gospel is that I'm going to be rejected, condemned, killed, mocked, spit upon. All of that has to happen so that I can legally buy you out of your bad situation and you can walk in new life. He wants us to have eyes to see. This morning, he wants us to be like Bartimaeus, to come to him and say, Jesus, would you just bring me out of darkness? And so here's how I want us to wrap up this morning. As we prepare our hearts for communion, I'm going to have the worship team come back up. And as we transition into a time of communion, the way that I want to prepare our hearts for communion this morning is I want to give you some time and space to really just ask yourself the question Jesus asked James and John and Bartimaeus. What do you want from him? Is it an I want my own way heart? Or is it, Jesus, would you bring me out of darkness? Would you give me a new life? And then I would ask you in these next few moments to just examine your heart. And are there places where you have darkness or sin or anger or hatred or jealousy or lust or rage or dishonesty or rebellion and wickedness present, that you need the good news of the gospel to come in and invade? The word that comes to my mind is the word surrender. Would you just surrender that this morning? And then as you feel ready, you can come, and again, let's remember where Jesus is headed. He's headed towards the cross to have his body broken and his blood shed so that we can walk in new life. And so let's remember that. And I want to pray that the Lord would give us eyes to see who he is and how desperately we need the good news to touch all of those bad places so that we can walk in new life. Would you pray with me? Jesus, I thank you for your word. I thank you for your example and how you have loved and pursued a broken people. Father, in these next few moments, I just pray that your Spirit would be present and would minister to each one of us. Lord, where there's conviction needed, would you bring it? God, where there are places where we have been living in willful rebellion, God, would your good news of who you are and what you've done just enter in and shine brightly so that we could walk in new life. And Jesus, as we come to the table, as we commune with you, as we allow our minds and our hearts to be stirred around the fact that you suffered, you were condemned and convicted, that you were legally murdered, that you were mocked, that you were disrespected, that you were beaten and killed. Father, let us celebrate that the tomb is empty, that victory is assured, but God, that you did that because of your love for us, because of who you are. And so, Father, would this time be worshipful? God, would it be pleasing to you and changing for us? It is in your mighty name we pray. Amen.